Right, so some of the biggest news coming out of the Middle East right now is that a ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas is now the closest that they have ever been. A line we've heard of before, of course. We've been here in this position previously, hoping each and every time that this time it will be different. Only to see Benjamin Netanyahu shift the goalposts each time instead and collapse the talks. And following that, inevitably come all the demands that Hamas be the ones that try harder by, for example, US mouthpieces so Israel-centric, you're often left wondering whose side they are really on to begin with. But this time things really are different, it seems. The desperation of those who have been pulling Netanyahu's strings before, the risk to his government collapsing, as has always been the threat if he ever agreed to a ceasefire, has to a certain extent lessened. The desperation in the voice of some bearing that out. But it hasn't gone away completely. And this has now been exposed more than ever as the real culprits behind collapsed ceasefire talks have exposed themselves. So there can be no doubt going forward as to who really is responsible for doing that. And should these ceasefire talks succeed or once again fail, we know who is really to blame for that. Right, so where I've been particularly cynical about ceasefire talks in the past, the hard right of Netanyahu's coalition government always threatening to pull down the government if he dares agree to a ceasefire in Gaza, seen as surrendering to Hamas as that is. I'm more optimistic this time that actually something positive could actually come out of this. But I'm only positive to a certain extent. So what has actually changed then, in which case to bring me out of my utter cynicism? Well, before we get on to that, what are both sides on the verge of accepting here? That would be a good place to start. It's a three-phase plan. We've heard that layout before, with each phase being carried out over 42 days each. And it's a proposal, all in all actually, that's broadly been put forward before. And certainly terms that Hamas have agreed to themselves previously. It's just Israel that hasn't. Yet now apparently that appears to be changing. Hamas have accepted the terms again already. It has been reported in multiple different sources before the mainstream or various other mouthpieces or political statesmen, as they call themselves, say otherwise. But I'll get on to why Israel may have now shifted in a moment. Phase 1 involves a temporary cessation of military operations by both sides and a 10-hour daily window where air activity ceases, rising to 12 hours on the days of prisoner exchanges, which will also be staged, prioritising women, children and the elderly, with 3 hostages released on the first day of implementing the agreement. Others will be released every 7 days thereafter during the first phase of the agreement, and negotiations on the second phase will begin on the 16th day of this initial truce. IDF forces will initiate staged withdrawals as the people of Gaza begin returning to their places of residence in stages as well. Intensive aid convoys will enter the strip from day 1, 600 trucks a day we're being told, with priorities being to get the power plant back up and running, along with hospital services, bakeries, and the entry of equipment to remove rubble. Sanitation, water and communications will also be brought back up and running, along with equipment for civil defence. Military wounded will be allowed to pass through the Rafah crossing for treatment. Passengers as well as the free movement of goods will return to this crossing as well. And while all of this goes on, the details of that second phase of the ceasefire agreement will be hammered out as aforementioned, which is why details on the second and third phases remain a little bit scant at the moment, but they present the possibility of matters falling apart partway through the first phase, as that does. So you do worry in the back of your minds that if Israel get a good number of their hostages back in phase 1, for example, they will take that as their win and resume attacks and just detonate stages 2 and 3. But we do need to maintain some sort of hopefulness here that this could finally be the end of war in Gaza, or genocide in Gaza, it would be more accurate to put it. Phase 2 would herald the permanent cessation of military activities and the remaining prisoner exchanges. By this time there would only be men left remaining, and would see the full withdrawal of Israel from Gaza. So that would be a big stage to get past. And phase 3 would see the exchange of all bodies and remains of the dead being exchanged, and a 3 to 5 year long plan for the reconstruction of Gaza be implemented, which would take place under the supervision of Egypt, Qatar and the US. So all of this Hamas have agreed to. We once again therefore set all eyes on Benjamin Netanyahu to see if this gets wrecked again. It's difficult to be too hopeful given how many times we've been in this place before, but there is one crucial difference this time as opposed to previous occasions. It's not really been a secret that the real people bringing down these ceasefire talks each time have been Itamar Ben-Gvir of Otzma Yehudit and Bezalel Smotrich of the Religious Zionist Party, the hard right of Netanyahu's coalition government. And between the two of them, more than capable of bringing down that government if Netanyahu doesn't jump to their tune. In fact, so precarious has Netanyahu's position been previously that either of them pulling their parties out of coalition would collapse the Israeli government and put Netanyahu out of power, and that would never do, would it? But that is no longer the case. Last September, the former coalition partner party, New Hope, rejoined Netanyahu's government, having pulled out in March following Netanyahu's refusal to give the New Hope party leader Gideon Sa'ar a place in the war cabinet. They are a splinter party from Netanyahu's own Likud party. They broke away in 2020, so are broadly speaking little different politically. This move, however, meant that Itamar Ben-Gvir's Otzma Yehudit no longer had the government collapsing clout it once did in and of itself, and he can now no longer collapse matters unless Bezalel Smotrich does it as well at the same time. As such, he's offered a bit of a begging video message to Smotrich in which he has said, "The deal that is taking shape is a surrender deal to Hamas. I call on my friend, Minister Bezalel Smotrich, to join me and work with me together against the surrender deal to Hamas. My party, Otzma Yehudit, alone does not have the power to prevent the deal. So I propose that we go together to the Prime Minister and tell him that if he approves the deal, we will withdraw from government. This cooperation is the only way to prevent a surrender deal, to prevent this disastrous deal, and to ensure that the sacrifices of hundreds of soldiers were not in vain." Sacrificing soldiers is something you are happy to do again and again and again, Sunshine, to get your own way, to keep this war, this genocide going. Because ultimately Ben-Gvir is the hero of the Zionist settler movement. They've all got designs on Gaza. So the last thing they want is for all of this to end. They don't just want Hamas gone, of course. They want all of the Palestinians gone as well. Other countries can take them. That's very much been the narrative from such staunch figures as Daniela Weiss, the head of the Nahala settler movement, who the IDF allowed into Gaza a few months back, basically to begin measuring the curtains up, and claiming she had 740 settler families ready to move into Gaza straight away. If you want an idea of how mad she truly is, she told a rally in the last couple of days in regards to this ceasefire deal that she won't accept surrender to terrorism and called for Netanyahu's government to actually be overthrown, such as how close things looked to a deal a few days ago, let alone now. As for Smotrich, well, his religious Zionist party is also heavily backed by hard-right settlers. He's been pretty much on the same page as Itamar Ben-Gvir throughout the genocide being meted out in Gaza. But there is a very subtle shift at this moment in time. And I don't know whether it is because he has secured so much in the way of additional powers for himself as far as the West Bank is concerned, that perhaps Gaza is no longer as important an issue to him personally anymore. But his language, his tone, slightly different, at least in this moment in time, to Ben-Gvir's, as this excerpt from Anadolu Agency explains. Far-right Israeli Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich announced on Monday his opposition to a potential prisoner exchange deal with Palestinian group Hamas, calling for opening the gates of hell on the enclave. The emerging deal is a catastrophe for Israel's national security, Smotrich, the leader of the religious Zionism party, said on his X account. The extremist minister, however, did not threaten to leave the government if the deal is approved. This is the time to continue with all our might to occupy and cleanse the entire strip, to finally take control of humanitarian aid from Hamas, and to open the gates of hell on Gaza until Hamas surrenders completely and all the hostages are returned, he said. On Sunday, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu met with Smotrich to try to persuade him to support the deal, according to the public broadcaster Kan. Smotrich has repeatedly expressed his opposition to any agreement with Palestinians and previously threatened to withdraw from the government if a deal is signed. Fundamentally, if Smotrich joins Ben-Gvir in making good on that threat to pull out of government, this deal will collapse, because these two are the ones behind every other collapse. Ben-Gvir has admitted it, in fact, so brazen and stupid the optics of what he is saying, having said on the 14th of January that he had prevented Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu from agreeing to several proposals for a ceasefire and prisoner swap with Hamas in Gaza over the past year. He is proud of it, a pontificating little monster on a power trip as he is. I'd be suspicious, actually, of a double cross in the offing should Smotrich go ahead with the deal, given his language is still pretty anti-ceasefire, as you can see. It's just the only difference between him and Ben-Gvir is the fact that he's not at this moment in time threatening to pull out of the coalition. But that some hostages would be rescued, but perhaps not all, to show Netanyahu as perhaps tried to get this through, blaming Hamas, as they always do later, of wrecking matters, them always being the convenient scapegoat. If Ben-Gvir had an about face, I'd be certain of this happening, though. What equally doesn't help is when other state actors involved in this are repeatedly dishonest about who is to blame, though. Every time, for example, as he has done again in recent days, Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, gets involved, he blames Hamas for any hold-ups, he blames Hamas for any collapses in agreement. But it isn't them. It never has been. It's Ben-Gvir. He's admitted to it now. So why can't you say it? Value your dual citizenship too much, is it? Between Blinken and Matthew Miller, I don't know which disingenuous apologist for genocide in the current US administration I want to see the back of more. Ultimately, whether this deal does go through hinges on Smotrich and what he chooses to do. He alone can bring this deal down if he wants to by threatening to collapse the government. Netanyahu will always put himself, power and his position as Prime Minister first, and if that happens here and now, as close as matters have gotten, just forget a ceasefire ever happening until there's a change in the Israeli government, because functionally they will be too paralysed by the far right in government to ever accept any kind of deal that doesn't appease the Israeli settlers. And the only deal they'll accept is if they get their sticky fingers on Gaza. Fingers crossed Smotrich puts his own ministerial position first here, and therefore this ceasefire goes through. But his language doesn't exactly inspire much confidence, does it? Meanwhile, as events seem to be slipping from the US's grip in Israel and Gaza, they very much are as well in Syria. They really do think their meddling and interference in foreign affairs works, don't they? You'd think they'd have learnt by now, but apparently not. With the new US-backed HTS administration of former Al-Qaeda head choppers now showing their true colours, as well as ongoing attacks on Syria by other state actors the US is supposedly allied with as well, they're getting in a right old mess. Get the details of that story in this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch. Please do also hit like, share and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already to help support the channel, which is enormously appreciated, as well as ensures you don't miss out on new daily content dropping daily as it does. And as such, I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.